Well, welcome back, and thanks again for joining me, guys. What we're talking about now is the interpretation of results from cohort studies. And as with any study design, I'm making the point that before we can assume that the measure of association we see in a cohort study reflects the true impact, the true effect of a risk factor on an outcome, we have to exclude alternative explanations. Last time we talked about the potential for bias. Now I want to talk about the potential for a bigger problem, confounding. So let's step back a minute. Let's think about the last series of lectures we had when we talked about experimental studies. We talked about randomized controlled trials. We talked about the investigator essentially flipping a coin and assigning people to either being the group that receives a new treatment or a group that receives standard of care treatment. Or, as in the physician's health study, which we talked about, the coin flip would assign a person either to take an aspirin or to take a placebo pill. And we made a point at that time to show you the first table of the physician's health study, to show you how balanced the group that was assigned to take aspirin was compared to the group that was assigned to take a placebo. The coin flip doesn't know your age. It doesn't matter whether you're old or young. You have a 50% chance of being placed in the aspirin group or the placebo group. So at the end of the day, you would expect in large randomized controlled trials that half of your people would be assigned to the aspirin group and half of your people would be assigned to the non-aspirin group among the elderly people. The distribution of age would be the same in the two groups. But what about in a cohort study? What about in studies where people choose themselves to take aspirin or take placebos? Or in the example we've been using, choose themselves to either to become smokers or to become non-smokers. Well, we'll talk more about confounding in much more details in a couple of weeks, but I just wanted to show you some of the Framingham Heart Study to describe the group of people who were smokers at the 1956 exam compared to the group of people who were non-smokers at the 1956 exam. And here's the beginning of a Table 1 to describe to the reader the distribution of potential risk factors for your outcome among the smokers and among the non-smokers to see how comparable, how balanced these two groups are. So unlike the randomized controlled trial where the coin flip was assigning a person to be treated or non-treated, in a cohort study, it's the individual themselves typically that determines whether they want to be exposed or non-exposed. So in your Framingham Heart Study data set that we've been using, we have a group of smokers and we have a group of non-smokers. Well, how comparable were they? Well, in terms of their average age, the average age of the non-smokers was 51, almost 52 years, about 4 years older on average than the smokers were. Older age brings with it higher risk of dying, higher risk of developing heart disease. Same thing if we look at their blood pressure. The blood pressure on average among the non-smokers is about 6 millimeters of mercury greater than that of the smokers. So right now there are two other characteristics that the non-smokers have that's not shared by the smokers. The non-smokers are older and the non-smokers have more heart disease. Those could be reasons why the non-smokers might get more heart disease than the smokers might have. On the other hand, if you look at the distribution of sex, 54% of the smokers are male, compared to only 34%. There's a much greater percentage of male sex among the smokers. So if I do a study, as we've been doing, measuring, say, the cumulative incidence of death among smokers compared to non-smokers, or the incidence rates of developing heart disease among smokers compared to non-smokers, the two groups I'm comparing, smokers and non-smokers, are not comparable. The non-smokers have two bad things going for them that the smokers don't have. They're older, they have higher blood pressure. The smokers have one other thing badly going for them compared to the non-smokers. They have lots of men. So there's lots of reasons why we might see different outcomes among the smokers or the non-smokers that's not attributed to the fact that an individual is smoking. This diagram explains what I've been talking about. We want to do a study to see if smoking itself impacts on the risk of developing, say, coronary heart disease. We're going to measure incidence rates among smokers, incidence rates among non-smokers, calculate an incidence rate ratio as a measure of association. But our problem as epidemiologists is, can we take that measure of association to reflect this causal influence that smoking might have on heart disease? And the problem is we have alternative reasons to suspect an association between smoking and heart disease that's not just the effect of smoking. We have these other factors, age, sex, and blood pressure that I showed you in the previous table, that are not balanced in the two groups. The smokers are younger. The smokers have lower blood pressure. The smokers have more men. Those are three reasons why the smokers might be expected to have less or more heart disease. These factors, age, sex, and blood pressure, are imbalanced in the smokers and non-smoking group we're comparing, and we expect them to be independent determinants, say risk factors for developing an outcome. So our problem as epidemiologists is to identify these factors, which we call confounding factors, and somehow either adjust for them in the analysis or design studies where they're not likely to be confounders. Those are topics we're going to be talking about in future lectures at the end of this course. But for the time being, we have to be sensitive to the fact that in cohort studies, confounding is a plausible explanation for the reason we see an association between a risk factor and an outcome. Well, more about confounding later. See you next time.